First level. Balustrade. Lower register. Jataka. The Buddha's past birth stories. Part 1. Cross-section of the Borobudur Temple. Locations of the panels. The panels are located in the lower register of the balustrade on the first level. A top view of the temple, with the balustrade on the first level highlighted in orange. The first level, with the balustrade on the left and the main wall on the right. The main focus is on the panels of the lower register of the balustrade. Lower register of the balustrade, level 1. The panels in this section are in a poor state of preservation. Many are either missing or heavily eroded, and a significant portion of the third layer of stones at the top of this register is absent. Only about half a dozen panels remain relatively complete, but even these are worn and damaged, making their features difficult to discern. Unlike other sections of Borobudur, this series of panels lacks accompanying inscriptions or textual markers, leaving their narrative ambiguous. The absence of explicit textual support makes it challenging to link these panels definitively to specific Jātaka Tales or other Buddhist narratives. Identifying their themes and stories relies primarily on visual analysis, but the condition of the panels complicates this effort. The main wall on the right, featuring upper and lower registers, and the balustrade on the left, also with upper and lower registers. Note how the panels in the lower register of the balustrade are eroded and incomplete. Another perspective of the incomplete panels. Another view showing areas where the panels are completely missing. Given the poor condition of the panels, a basic description of what can be observed is provided in the following discussion. However, the narrative can only be inferred, and while some sequences are occasionally discernible, they remain largely elusive. Panel 1. A dancing girl. The left side of the first panel is entirely missing, while only a portion of the right side remains intact. From the surviving section, a dancing girl can be discerned performing before a wealthy man and his wife, who are seated on the left. Below the dancer, a pot is held by a drummer, and behind her, other dancers appear to be observing the performance. Panel 2. A plowman and a rich man. The panel portrays a plowman on the left, a figure seated with a large bowl in the center, and two individuals approaching what appears to be a wealthy man or king. They present offerings, which are accepted with a touch of his hand. A divider. This series includes several dividers, typically depicting a male and a female, or a male with two females, standing together. Their purpose beyond serving as dividers is unclear, and they seem unrelated to the stories. Due to their damaged state, many of these dividers have been excluded from this sequence. However, those with more intricate decoration or that are relatively intact have been included. Panel 3. A king receives an illustrious guest. On the left, a king is seated with his queen on a simple raised platform, accompanied by a couple of attendants sitting behind him. In front of the king, a guest has arrived and is bowing respectfully, while behind him, several soldiers are seated, with an elephant behind them. It might depict a general reporting to his king, but this interpretation remains uncertain. This divider shows three figures, a central figure holding a large pot, possibly of water or gold, a female on the left, and a male on the right. Panel 4a. The monk meditates in the forest. This is the first of 4 connected panels depicting the same monk. In this corner panel, the monk is shown meditating alone in a forest, surrounded by trees and animals, including a pair of deer. Some parts of the panel appear unfinished. Panel 4b. The monk is visited by a hunter. This is the second part of the corner panel, both labeled as number 4, though they clearly depict different scenes. In this panel, the monk is visited by a hunter, who appears to have encountered him in the forest. The hunter holds a spear and is accompanied by 3 companions. Panel 5. The monk teaches dharma. In the third panel of this sequence, the monk is depicted in a teaching posture, with the 4 men from the previous panel seated on the floor, listening to his dharma teachings. One man still holds a spear, while the one in front clasps his hands in anjali. Panel 6. The monk teaches the nagas. In the final panel of this series, the monk is once again depicted teaching, but this time his 4 interlocutors appear to be nagas. The figure on the far left is clearly identifiable as a naga, while the others, though damaged in the characteristic headdress, seem to be of the same kind. Between the monk, seated in a simple pavilion, and the first naga, there is a basket that appears to contain a large pearl or jewel. Panel 7. King sends out wealth for distribution. The entire top row of blocks in this panel is missing, but enough remains to understand the scene. On the left, a king is seated with his queen behind him. In front of the king, a man collects pots of wealth and appears to distribute them through intermediaries to 2 poor individuals on the far right, one of whom extends his hand to receive the gift. Panel 8. A procession. A heavily damaged panel depicts one of Borobudur's favorite themes, a procession. The scene shows musicians, an elephant, and other revelers moving to the right. Panel 9. A man approaches the queen. On the far left, a man is depicted walking toward the right, with a large chest positioned in front of him, though his connection to it remains unclear. On the right, a queen is seated comfortably on a throne, surrounded by her ladies in waiting. A divider. 2 figures stand holding what appear to be floral offerings arranged in dishes. The figure on the right seems to be male, while the one on the left is likely female, though their identities are not clearly defined. Panel 10. Nuns at their studies. On the left, a row of 6 nuns is depicted inside a pavilion, accompanied by 2 laywomen to their left. They appear to be seated with their teacher, who has a book placed on a stand in front of her. Although the teacher's head is missing, the attire supports this interpretation. The structure on the far right is likely a temple. Panel 11. A couple receive 3 guests. On the left, a couple is seated on a raised platform. Their lack of elaborate decoration makes their identities unclear. In front of them are 3 guests, with the one in the front raising his hands in respect. The block in the bottom left of this panel appears to be misplaced, as it depicts a hand pressing down, which seems out of place with the rest of the scene. Panel 12AA. King receives visitors. This is the first section of a corner panel, though it seems to depict 2 distinct scenes. A king sits with his queen behind him, on a raised seat or throne, his hand held out in front of him with an open palm. In front of him, 5 visitors are seated on the floor, with the one in front offering his hands in anjali. Above them are a parasol, a standard topped with a wheel, and a leaf fan or shade. The visitors appear to be wealthy themselves. Panel 12B. Someone receives visitors. This panel is heavily eroded, making the details difficult to discern. On the right, it likely depicted a king and his queen seated on a throne or raised seat. Whether the carving was left unfinished or has simply deteriorated over time is unclear. On the left, 3 figures are seated under a tree, gesturing as if engaged in conversation with the king. Panel 13. A monk builds a stupa. While the panel might depict 3 monks, it more likely represents a single monk at 3 different moments. On the left, he is shown seated in meditation. In the center, he sits beside 2 small stupas, possibly models. On the right, he kneels before a large stupa. The scenes appear to be set in a wilderness, as suggested by the stylized rocks and trees, including a banana tree on the far right. Panel 14. A monk in 3 scenes. Once again, the panel appears to depict a single monk in 3 distinct scenes. On the left, the monk is likely the figure standing, as a male and female pay their respects before him. In the center, he seems to be pouring water over the head of a bearded man. On the right, he is likely receiving a pot and a dish from a wealthy benefactor, and his wife inside a pavilion. Panel 15. A banquet. At the center of this panel is what appears to be a large dish containing rice, fish, and other foods. To the left, a group of 6 people is seated, with 1 additional figure standing nearby. On the right, another group of 4 people is depicted. On the far right, a grand house is visible, complete with a staircase leading down from it, and flanked by 2 large birds. Panel 16. King and a Pratyeka Buddha. At the center of this panel, within a pavilion, a wealthy man, likely a king, is seated with 3 concubines behind him. To the far left, his palace or residence is depicted. On the right, a figure is shown ascending into the sky, presumably a Pratyeka Buddha. Below, a group of people is seated on the ground, accompanied by a heavily worn figure standing nearby. Panel 17. King receives a visitor. On the podium to the left, a king sits alongside his queen or consort, extending his hand, presumably in a gesture of blessing. Seated before him is a male figure listening attentively. Behind this figure sits a row of soldiers, possibly under their command. On the far right, an intriguing scene unfolds, a forest setting featuring a large serpent coiled within a hole. Panel 18. An interview and gods flying through the air. This panel presents 2 distinct scenes. On the left, a man sits in a relaxed posture, leaning on one of his companions, engaged in conversation with 2 women seated opposite him, on a slightly raised platform. In the center, a wishing tree serves as a divider between the scenes. On the right, what appear to be gods are depicted carrying offerings as they fly toward the next panel, which seems to continue the narrative. Panel 19. A deva visits a king at night. At the center of this panel, a king reclines on a couch while 2 female attendants tend to him. Slightly left of center, a deva is depicted flying through the air toward the king. Below the deva, 2 guards are shown asleep, indicating a nighttime setting. Additional guards are positioned on the far right of the panel. Panel 20. Offerings are brought to the king. Much of this panel is missing, but enough remains to discern the scene. On the left, a king sits with his queen, while a man seated on the floor in front of them turns to glance back at a group of people, bringing pots filled with some form of wealth to the king. At the center, A treasure chest adorned with garlands is prominently displayed. Panel 21. A procession. This heavily damaged and worn panel is difficult to interpret. It appears to depict a group moving toward the right, though details are unclear. One figure seems to have a naga headdress, but even this identification remains uncertain. Panel 22. A king receives visitors. To the left, a richly adorned building stands out, featuring pillars and decorative festoons. In the lower right, a decorated pot is positioned beneath a tree. On the right side of this corner panel, a king is seated with his queen inside a pavilion, while two men sit on the ground before him. Panel 23. Approaching a meditator. This panel is heavily damaged. On the far left, stylized rocks and trees indicate a wilderness setting. Someone was likely seated in meditation nearby, but only the lower part of his legs remains visible. Approaching from the right is a figure dressed in finery, with an attendant kneeling at his feet. In the center, a kinara can be seen perched in a tree. Panel 24. A king receives homage. The two seated figures slightly right of center appear to be the main focus of this panel, likely representing a king and queen. To their right, two Brahmins stand, one raising his hands in reverence. On the far left, a figure holds what seems to be a small stupa, while others carry garments and additional offerings. Notable elements include two large pots, one positioned in the center and the other on the far right. Panel 25. A king at court. Based on the decoration and arrangement, this appears to depict the same couple featured in the previous panel. They are seated within a simple pavilion, with the queen accompanied by a female attendant. Additional attendants are positioned to the left beneath a tree. On the right, a visitor is shown seated with hands in anjali, while his entourage behind him adopt various postures. Panel 26. Homage to three stupas. At the center of this panel are three stupas, with the central one larger than the two on either side. A pavilion adorned with lotus flowers hangs above them. Devotees are gathered on both the left and right, engaged in worship, offering rituals, or observing the scene. Panel 27. A queen at court. On the right, a queen is seated while an attendant massages her legs. Surrounding her are other ladies. At the center stands a coconut tree, while on the far left is another tree with large pots beneath it, symbolizing wealth. Between the two trees, a couple of figures can be seen. Panel 28. Before the palace. A heavily worn panel likely depicts a palace, flanked by fly whisks on either side. Two individuals are shown kneeling before the palace. The figure on the far right appears to be holding a parasol over the central character within, though the extensive damage makes this uncertain. Panel 29. A king and queen receive guests. In this corner panel, a king and queen are seated on a raised throne, with the king in a relaxed posture, his legs supported by a knee strap. To the right, a visitor is seated on another elevated seat, though the severe damage to the panel obscures further details. The right section of the panel depicts additional figures seated on the floor. Two of them, dressed in finery, have their hands raised in anjali, suggesting they are likely fellow visitors rather than attendants. Panel 30. A procession scene. This panel showcases one of the procession scenes that the Borobudur sculptors excelled at. At the center, an elephant adorned with a bell around its neck strides to the right. To its right stands a man holding a drum, while on the left, a group of people is depicted, including one figure shown with his back turned to the viewer. Panel 31, people kneeling. Most of this panel is missing. On the left we see two ladies sitting. Near the middle two others kneel. Panel 32, people kneel before a stupa. A group of people is shown kneeling, likely before a stupa that once occupied the far right of the panel. Some devotees carry offerings, while others appear to be holding their hands in reverent salutation. Panel 33, a palace and a wishing tree. On the far left, a wishing tree stands beside a male figure. At the center, an elaborate multi-story building dominates the scene. To its right, another figure, possibly female, stands nearby, followed by a second tree on the far right. Panel 34, a blank panel. All the carved blocks from this panel are missing. Though no scene remains, the exposed surface is still informative, revealing how the stones were cut and arranged, often irregular in shape and size, and offering insight into the initial masonry before carving commenced. Panel 35, offerings to the king. Despite significant damage, enough details remain to grasp the main action. On the left, a couple sits on a raised seat, while behind them, someone holds a basket, likely filled with flowers. In front of them, a large box adorned with flowers rests on the ground, with a seated figure presenting it, probably as an offering, to the king. To the right, more individuals are depicted sitting on the ground. Panel 36, a lotus pond in Kinnaras. This corner panel depicts a king standing with one hand on his hip as he approaches a lotus pond on the right. The pond is filled with tall, blooming lotuses. To the left, a kinnara is visible, with two more above the flowers. Between the king and the pond, a wishing tree stands, bridging the two elements of the scene. Panel 37, a meeting. A prominent figure, potentially male or female, sits on a raised seat within a pavilion featuring a curved roof. Behind them are three elegantly dressed individuals, likely courtiers rather than attendants. In front, a well-dressed man, probably a visitor, appears to be offering worship, while his attendants sit behind him. Panel 38, a chariot goes to the wilderness. An important figure is seen in his chariot, heading into the wilderness, which is depicted stylistically on the right. The driver's hand is raised, holding a standard, while soldiers are following behind, swords in hand. Panel 39, at the lotus pond. The character who was journeying into the wilderness in the previous scene has now arrived, and once again, he is depicted at the lotus pond shown in corner panel 36b. On the right of the pond, the kinnaras appear once more. This suggests that the last few panels are part of a sequence, although the story they convey remains unclear. Panel 40. Going to the stupa. It is presumed that the same character, seen earlier, is now visiting a stupa. Since the chariot and horses, along with those who follow, are depicted as floating, it is inferred that they are arriving from the celestial realms. At the stupa, devotees are already gathered around. Panel 41, the bull and the lion. This panel contains three distinct scenes. On the left, cattle rest peacefully. In the center, a lion launches an attack, seemingly confronted by a bull attempting to deter him. On the right, the bull grazes undisturbed. Like many other panels, This one does not correspond to any known story. Panel 42. Monks at a temple. At the center stands an elaborately decorated temple. To the left, figures likely representing worshippers are depicted. On the right, within a pavilion, monks are seated, while on the far right, lay devotees are present. Panel 43. Watching the dancer and musician. This is another corner panel. A figure is seated in a relaxed posture on a large cushion, surrounded by others, who are also at ease within an elaborate building. On the right side of the panel, one woman dances while another watches. At the center, a drummer, captured in a dynamic pose, keeps rhythm on his drum. Panel 44. Devas fly through the air. A group of 8 devas is depicted soaring through the air, moving toward the next scene. The panel is damaged, and even the remaining portions are heavily worn. Panel 45. Worshipping at the temple. This panel is among the most remarkable in the series, both for its craftsmanship and its state of preservation. At the center stands a temple adorned with 5 small stupas atop its central section. To the left, a peacock perches on a wall, while further left, a worshipper stands with hands clasped in reverence. On the far right, another figure is present, though the details of his actions remain unclear. Panel 46. A procession to the left. This scene is quite unusual, as the action typically moves to the right, whereas here it unfolds toward the left. On the far left, 2 figures stand at what seems to be the focal point, though damage to the panel obscures their identities. A chariot is approaching, accompanied by numerous soldiers. Panel 47. A king receives visitors. On the center right, the king is seated alongside his consorts, with ladies in waiting behind them. They are receiving visitors seated on the floor before them, who must be wealthy and influential, as evidenced by the elephant accompanying them on the far left. A charming detail is the mount gently holding the elephant's trunk as the conversation unfolds. Panel 48. The king receives a Brahmin. At the center, a figure presumed to be a king is seated, with his consort kneeling behind him. In front of him, a visiting Brahmin is depicted, though severe damage to the panel obscures further details. On the far right, several individuals are seated within an ornate building. Panel 49. A king receives homage. Once again, a king is depicted seated on a cushion, receiving visitors. Behind him, a group of ladies sits, one holding flowers. In front of him, 3 young men sit on the floor, presenting offerings, while behind them, 4 more men carry additional offerings. Panel 50. Bringing a duck to the king. Like many other panels, this one is missing its top row, and several sections are heavily worn. However, an intriguing detail remains visible. A visitor to the king is carrying a duck. Despite this, no corresponding story from Buddhist literature has yet been identified. A divider. This dividing panel features a couple, as usual, but is particularly notable for depicting a man with his arm around the woman's shoulder, holding her in an affectionate embrace. Panel 51. The king watches the dancing. On the left, the king is seated on a large divan, surrounded by his queens and ladies in waiting, all observing the scene to the right. There, 4 dancers perform alongside musicians including a couple playing tablas and a pot drum. Panel 52. Monks meet with lay women. the center, 5 monks are seated inside a pavilion, positioned in front of a temple building depicted on the right. On the far left, 3 affluent women kneel beneath a tree, listening attentively to the teachings being offered. This concludes part 1 of the Jataka, the Buddha's past birth stories.